Good morning, good evening, good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Candid Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela Word, and I am also the creator of KandidKayla.com, the producing company of this podcast. Here on this circle of the internet, we are dedicated to growing ourselves in ourselves and for ourselves through the eight dimensions of wellness, with an understanding that we want to be active participants in our relationship with God, ourselves, and the people around us, with the purpose of reaching optimal health on a consistent basis. Understanding that this is a journey and that once you hit health, you got to maintain it. And so that's what we talk about over here on this circle of the internet. As the title suggests, today's podcast is all about us being the villain in other people's story. And so we're going to go ahead and get started as we do so well with the prayer. I'm going to give you guys some background behind the topic of conversation, why it's particularly important, a little bit of a switch up today. We're actually going to be talking about practical things, practical skills that are necessary for us when we have become the villain in someone's story. And then finally, we'll be talking about how we can pull from that in order for us to get to a place of ultimate health and the people around us to get to a place of ultimate health. So let's go ahead and pray this morning. Dear Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you, God, for covering and keeping and protecting. I pray that you would be with me as I speak. Allow people's lives to be changed. Allow my life to be changed based on this conversation. I pray that you would be the example for us. We thank you again for your word, and we thank you again for this opportunity. And in Jesus' name, amen. So, as was mentioned, I guess before we even jump into today's topic, y'all hear all different kinds of noises that you usually don't hear. And that is because I'm trying something new. I'm trying to walk outside while we have these conversations and dialogue. So we'll see how that works. It may stick, it may not stick, but typically I record these on my way to work. But it's gorgeous outside, and I don't have to go to work today, like into work today. So let's go ahead and get this started. So we spoke in a previous part about villainizing other people and how dangerous it is when we choose to villainize people. More specifically, we talked about how I think it's detrimental for us to villainize people, right? Like, we should see people as whole individuals, and even though they've done something to hurt you, we should not villainize them. You can go back and listen to that podcast. But one of the things I said to kind of help us not villainize people is to view people with humanity and grace and understand that we can very much so be the villain in somebody's story. And I think this was a concept that I kind of briefly touched over, and I really wanted to discuss it more thoroughly. Is a concept that no one person is always innocent. I mean, here, Jesus was considered blameless, but he was the villain in the Pharisee story, or all those other people. Well, they wouldn't have crucified him otherwise. And so, at any given point in your life, you are the villain in someone's story. It is what it is. Now, how do we respond when we're the villain in someone's story? I think it's important. And that's what we're going to discuss fully today is how we're supposed to respond as the villain in someone's story. Because I have spoken on this on multiple podcasts, this concept of true healing coming when we can live with someone who has done us wrong. But on the other hand, what I haven't spoken about is living in the and, living in this coexistence with someone that you have done wrong. So I think this is more practically seen in marriage relationships, dating relationships, like romantic type relationships that last for a very long time because you're bound to offend your partner at some point, but you still love them and still got to be with them. And so, how do you coexist with someone who consider you their villain, who you have hurt, And in the same way, how do you grow from this experience to both benefit you and the person that you have hurt? Now, I understand that you could be the villain in someone's story and have never done anything wrong. Again, that example of Jesus, just being himself, was instinctively offensive. And as a Black woman in America, I would be remiss if I didn't say that my existence on a certain level is offensive to a vast majority of people because I have opinions. I am not necessarily extroverted, but I do speak my mind in certain arenas. And most importantly, I think the fact that I'm educated and people instinctively expect me to be dumb is offensive without me ever opening my mouth. Um, so with that, I think learning how to navigate in these spaces when you are offensive, even unintentionally, but also once you've hurt someone intentionally as well, how do we navigate these spaces? So, the first thing, like I said, so that's a bit of the background going into like the meat, the bread and butter of it all, understanding that the first thing is to just acknowledge that you're the villain. I think so often we want to not accept that we're the villain in someone's story. We want to just say, "Oh, hey, they're crazy, or I did nothing wrong, or they did something to me first." And that's just the defense mechanism is to look at someone and to say they've done something or they're crazy. Like if you put all the blame on them rather than evaluating the situation from their lens. I mean, we just do it by nature and our human nature to protect ourselves. But again, and you can't choose when you are and when you are not the villain in someone's story. More importantly, and this I think is so profound, you can't change somebody's narrative. That's their choice. You can own what you have done, empathize with how they feel by seeing life from their lens and their view, but again, you cannot change how someone feels about yourself. And I understand that being the villain in the story isn't particularly good. I mean, even in Disney stories, like the villain always has this evolutionary story that made them that way. Nobody typically wants to be a villain, which is why we, in our own eyes, portray ourselves as not being a bad person. But regardless of what your intent was, even if it was intentional, but regardless of what your intent was, how someone else feels is not your responsibility. It's also not your responsibility to change their mind on how they feel. And this is difficult because a lot of times we want to feel justified or vindicated by like proving our point or giving out our case. Like prime example is someone says that I offended them, right? And it was unintentional. Usually you can have a conversation, definitely, and maybe like present, like, oh, this is why I did it. It wasn't on purpose. But the person is still offended. And even if you all agree that it wasn't your intent and that person forgives you, it's their choice to forgive you and move on with you, not yours to change their mind. In the same way, if you don't have an opportunity to defend yourself, don't go seeking out that person. Don't go trying to push your will and how you see the situation onto them because that's not your responsibility. You showed up as you, and regardless of how that might have been portrayed or taken, they were offended, right? So you were still you. The only thing you can do is own up to your portion of what you've done. And if you would like to do things differently in the future, take that and so forth. So that's the next point. Evaluate now your position in the situation. So once you've seen the situation from their perspective, now view you and what you could have done differently in that situation. A lot of times these are simultaneous, right? But like if someone says that I cursed them out in a rage, I think that's really easy for me to see my position. I should know how to hold my temper, right? But if someone says that They think that what did they say to me? They thought that I was rude, mean, because I choose not to speak in a mixed environment. Well, then I can only stand behind my actions and say that they're probably projecting something onto me because rude would be to say something wrong, not to say nothing at all, depending on the situation. So I think that viewing it from this perspective, now you have all of the information gathered. You can see it from their perspective. You now can see what you would like to have done differently. And in some cases, that's nothing. And you got to own that and you got to sit with that. But sometimes it's nothing. And then finally, once you've done that, you have to learn how to live with them again. And this is so difficult because a lot of times people just want to cut off. And that's fine. If somebody wants to cut you off, you get a free pass in a certain instance, right? Like, I think we think that when someone cuts us off, it's a bad thing. And again, we like to go plead our case, or we want that person to contact us, or we keep going back and back and back. But sometimes them cutting you off is the best thing, maybe not for both of your healing, but for you as an individual, because now you don't have to deal with the wishy-washiness of them choosing or lack thereof to be for you. They're not for you. Cool. Now you don't have to deal with it. Now, the hard thing is having to coexist with someone now that you've offended. I heard something one time and they were talking about a gentleman who had cheated on his wife. And he was like, clearly she was offended, you know? That's not a little offend. But then on top of her being offended, he had to give her space and room to grow in that and like feel all that she needed to feel. And he said his wife was mad for maybe 3 years. And that seems like a long time to just coexist with someone who doesn't like you. But you both are going to grow from this experience and get to a place of ultimate healing, hopefully, over that time. And so learning to allow people to have the space that they need to feel the way that they feel, despite your intentions were, that is how you learn to coexist in the balance. Um, Another example is if you have like a coworker who constantly demeans you, you know, you don't have to be best friends with that person, but you do need to have, like, so you as the offended, them feeling like the villain, with them being the villain in your story, you're probably the villain in their story in some subconscious way. You can choose boundary, definitely. You don't have to deal with misbehavior or mistreatment of you. But at the same time, understand that by just separating yourself, that's not a boundary, that's avoidance. And so it takes a lot more strength to learn healthy boundaries, to invoke healthy boundaries, than it does to practice avoidance, which is what we typically want to do. So that's evaluating how to actually live as a villain in someone's story. Now, let's talk about something that nobody ever talks about, and that is how you feel as the villain in someone's story. So often, I see two different cases, but they are pretty much the same thing. You have someone who internalizes everything and becomes sad, and then you have someone who internalizes being the villain in the story and becomes apathetic. And both are trauma responses. Rather than just owning up to your position, realizing that that person is hurt, and don't write off how they feel, right? Because a lot of times people are like, oh, they'll get over it. They'll be all right. No, I acknowledge why they feel the way that they feel. Regardless of how they feel, this is how I view myself, and this is how I view the relationship. Not being, again, apathetic. So, how do we deal with all of the emotions that come from being the villain in someone's story? I know for me personally, for a long time, I internalized it and I became the villain, right? Like, I became so distant from everyone in my life based on the opinion of one person that I felt as though I didn't think I was a good person anymore. So, in order not to continue to hurt people and be offensive, I distanced myself from everyone and everything. And that is a trauma response in and of itself. Who died and made that one person God to view you in that way, or to tell you who you are, or to define who you are based on an experience? Now, if you see from that experience, hey, I could have done things differently, you could have done things differently. Just do things differently next time. But aside from doing things differently, right, there's nothing you can do but continue to move forward. Don't allow somebody else's opinion of you to define you. What do you say about yourself? Especially when your intentions, I think a lot of times we have a tendency to think that we're bad people when our intentions are directly attached to trauma and traumatic events, right? If I have somebody who is suffocating me emotionally, literally, whatever have you, if I have someone who is literally suffocating me and I punch them in the face, emotionally or physically, right? I'm protecting myself. But a lot of times we don't see these trauma responses as the protection of us because that person is so offended at the fact that you just punched them in the face. We have a tendency to be like, oh, I'm a bad person. I don't belong here. I don't belong in these spaces. I just deserve all the bad in the world. And that's poor thinking. You can view your position and their position simultaneously. You can see your trauma, respect your trauma, and acknowledge their hurt feeling at the same time. The two can both be. It's not one or the other. There's duality in life. There's so much gray in life that I think we hinder ourselves again from this place of full healing. The healing on your part is that you need to heal your trauma. You need to deal with your triggers. You need to find new coping mechanisms, right? On the other person's side, their healing comes from viewing you as an individual, whether that be you now have new boundaries based on the situation that took place between you and that person, or that person realizes that they were a trigger. And based on them being a trigger, well, how can they no longer be a trigger if they want to continue to be in a relationship with you? So it's a very nuanced thing, right? Where we just think that people are going to always love us, and then when they don't, or they're hurt by something we've done, you don't want to do the work in order to heal and mend those relations. On the other side, there's those who get apathetic that I talked about. And when you're becoming apathetic, the issue now becomes that you have a hardened heart. And God tells us all the time, the Bible speaks all the time about the callous heart and how we're supposed to have a heart of flesh. If we're not getting hurt throughout life, then we're not loving the right way. The intent of life, at a very bare minimum, is to love so hard that you do experience pain, regardless of what people believe. It's a part of the suffering of life. You don't truly love, unless you've experienced some form of pain. And so to become sympathetic and to feel like that person's feelings don't matter in an effort to save your own means that you're not dealing with the feelings that you truly have about yourself. More often than not, that's where you truly do become a villain and try to mask it with lamb's clothing because you're not dealing with the internal nature of pain that you're suffering with. And that internal nature of pain will turn into trauma. Trauma, whether that be for other people or a direct reflection of trauma that you've experienced yourself, that develops into further trauma and continues to go untreated. See, hurt people hurt people. So if we're not actively working on building and healing and growing, we're going to continue to bleed all over everyone. And then say that it's everybody else's fault because we don't want to deal with our own mess. And that is so problematic for the world that we live in because people aren't going to ever get healing if you're not willing to help heal yourself. Think about it. If hurt people, in the same way, the opposite must be true. And that's just how science and math and the world works. If you go up, it must come down. If you have positive, you must have negative. So, in the same way, if hurt people, healed people help heal people. And so, if you're not dealing with the trauma and the mess in your life because you're not willing to sit with how you truly feel and sit with what you've really done, well, then you're going to continue to bleed all over the people. But think about it. If you heal yourself, you can heal and help heal and influence healing on everybody else in your circle and in your life. It's this concept of if you have somebody who's been an alcoholic for 10 years, right, because of something traumatic that happened, and they come back to you and they say, I'm no longer an alcoholic because I'm starting to deal with my trauma. Well, then that's going to make everybody else in that person's life reevaluate, right, what they've done and how they can heal because of the miraculous power of that person's healing. It's just that simple. Or let's say you're someone who flips your top real easy, right? And then you encounter something one day, you're at a restaurant, somebody disrespects you, and you don't flip your top. Well, then everybody who knows you and is in your circle is going to be like, wait a minute, what does he have? What has he done that he's no longer flipping tables on everybody? And how can I get a piece of that? And now you've helped heal the other people in your circle. So, like I said, this concept of this coexisting, right? More in particular, I think this is probably the best example. If your husband has cheated on you, or your boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever, same, whatever. If somebody in your life has offended you and hurt you, and everyone knows about it, and you continue to show them love and kindness despite the pain that you feel, you have an electric effect on them because you're now teaching healing through evidence of kindness and grace to other people that otherwise wouldn't have been seen. Like I said, that person who was talking about cheating on his wife and the effect that it had and her being alive for 3 years, it was her and his example that proved to me personally that you can truly, if you can heal from something like infidelity, well, then why can't you be healed from something like offense? And it's simple. It all requires healing. But we got to work through the mess in order to get there rather than cutting people off and expecting things to mend themselves otherwise. So, as the villain, practically, to sum it up and review points I already said, as the villain in someone else's story, what can we do in order to coexist with the people that we've offended or that we've hurt or that we've had a negative encounter with? How can we get to a place of healing with these individuals? And sometimes we don't get healing. I meant to inform that, put that in there. If I cut someone off and they're having a bad day, I've now become the villain in their story, but I don't know that person. There's nothing I can do in order to make the person feel any better. So sometimes you don't get closure and sometimes you don't get healing, even with people that are closer in your life because of their immaturity and their lack of wanting to heal and find peace and healing. But for those who do choose the hard road, choose to live in the and with somebody that they've offended, first of all, like we said before, we got to acknowledge how that person feels and why they feel that way. The second thing we have to do is acknowledge our participation in the event, whether that be, positive or negative. So we still have to acknowledge, despite our intent, what we have done and how that is reflected onto us, what we believe about ourselves, which is probably a little bit easier than saying it from the other person's perspective. The third thing that we have to do is we have to learn how to coexist with that person by giving that person the space that they need to heal while still not choosing to walk away or to cut that person off. And sometimes this is something I forgot. It's just a bit of an asterisk. Sometimes they're going to continue to act out of pain and they are going to continue to hurt you. And at that point, you now have multiple incidences, not one, and you yourself are allowed to invoke boundaries as well until they get to a place of healing. But that is a choice that you have to make. And understanding there's a difference between boundaries and avoidance. The last thing we talked about is not allowing somebody else's feeling of you being the villain in their story to affect how you view yourself. Because how you view yourself is ultimately your choice. It is your perspective of who you are. You know yourself better than anyone else. So even if you've done something villainous, acknowledge the trauma or pain that that came from, but also acknowledge all the beauty and joy and happiness and wholeness that is in you despite that pain, in an effort for you to get to a place of healing. So as you're healing, the other person in the event should also be healing, and then you all can come together to a space of ultimate healing and freedom. Lots of it. All right. Thank you all so much again for listening to the podcast. Um, if you all do not connect with us on our socials, then please do. Again, until next time, thank you guys and bye.